Welcome to Women on Wisdom. I'm your host, Sandra Boyd, and this is where real stories meet urgent truth. It's estimated that it will take nearly 124 years to close the gender gap. That's just way too long. We can no longer depend on governments, workplaces, or even women's groups to lead the change. It's up to us to have the tough conversations, challenge old stories, and reclaim our power. The time for waiting is over. The movement starts now, one woman at a time. Welcome to Women on Wisdom. I'm your host, Sandra Boyd. Imagine you're going about your day just like any other day, and then you get that phone call, the one that changes everything. Suddenly, every aspect of your life is thrown into chaos. And for many of us with aging parents, that life-altering event is just one phone call away. And as the World Health Organization emphasizes, women account for approximately 75% of unpaid caregivers worldwide. Today, we're diving into this critical issue with two extraordinary guests. First, let me welcome Susan Van Klink. Susan is the founder and CEO of SVK and Associates and a growth advisor for funded startups. However, many of you know Susan, including myself, from her LinkedIn posts on caring for her father. We also have Deborah Bakhti. Deborah is the president of Think Breakthrough. She is also the host of the Empathy Exchange podcast and the published author of Recipe for Empathy and Now What? Deborah writes and speaks about her experience caregiving for her husband, her mother, and her dad until they passed. Whether you're currently caring for a loved one or know of people who are, this episode will bring you both wisdom and insight. Good morning to you both. And I am very, I wouldn't say excited to have this conversation, but I am inspired to have this conversation because not only do I want to hear your journey, but I also know because I was on this journey this time actually in September 2 years ago with my mother and previously with my father, and now we're on the journey with my parents. So this is talking about caregiving is near and dear to my heart, but it's also impacting the majority of the people that I know. So welcome, Sue and Deb. And I'd like to, first of all, get started. And maybe Deb, you can start us off here, is if you can kind of give us a high level overview about who you are, your career, and then your unique personal journey in caregiving. Not only did you go on a journey, you were an executive in long-term care, and you also turned this into an incredible career for yourself after lessons learned. So love to hear your story.
Oh, thanks, Sandra, and thanks for having me on your podcast. Yeah, as you mentioned, so I worked as an executive, as a vice president at Extendicare, which is Canada's largest seniors care organization, for 11 years. And it was during that time working in seniors care that I became a family member 3 times. The first was with my dad when he needed to be moved into long-term care, where he lived for 6 months before passing away in 2011. And at the same time that my dad was being moved into care, I had been grappling with my husband's Ty's illness that ended up forcing us to make the really hard decision to move him at the age of 63 into long-term care. So I became a resident's wife, and he lived in long-term care for 4 years before passing away in 2015. And I was still working at Extendicare in my corporate career and, doing all the things. Our kids were 11 and 16 when their dad got sick, and managing being basically a sole parent provider, running a household and running a pretty intensive job career. And then my third experience was with my mom when I needed to move her into independent living. My two brothers and I helped her to make that decision to basically downsize by probably 70% to move into independent living. And then got a call that they needed her to move out because her needs had increased and they weren't equipped to take care of those needs. So then we moved my mom into assisted living, where she lived for a few years before passing away in 2019. So I made the decision in 2018 to leave my corporate world. I mean, as you know, we worked together in our corporate roles. I mean, that was my DNA. That's what I knew. And decided, in my mid 50s to walk away from that and start my company, Think Breakthrough. And I've been at it for 8 years now, and I work exclusively in seniors care, and I work to help providers, organizations, as well as residents' families to build a strong relationship based on trust and respect. And that may sound like a pretty easy job, but in fact, there's a lot of challenges that come with that relationship that I experienced personally as a family member. And it was through those lessons learned and having this unique perspective of understanding the business, the operations of seniors care, as well as the personal experience being a family member, and how we really need to transform that relationship to be more relational and not transactional, which a lot of times, unfortunately, healthcare can tend to be.
Yeah, the healthcare. We can have a whole episode on how to navigate healthcare when you're
Yeah.
trying to take care of family members and the impact that has on you. And and Deborah, your journey was very compact. It happened in a with your three with your parents, and then with Ty. It was a pretty short period of time. I mean, it probably felt like forever while you were going through it. But what was that? Uh, the the span between the three?
Well, my husband got sick in 2008 and then passed away in 2015. And I would say, as much as yes, it was a challenge to be navigating as a daughter for my parents. The really intensive work was, of course, with my husband being a spouse. And it was grueling, there's no question, while trying to manage everything. It's not like I could just step away from my work. I had a very supportive group of people that I worked with because they worked in seniors care. It really, really was a blessing in disguise that I was working in the industry that I'd become a customer in. And also trying to navigate the grief and experience for both of our kids. They had no peer support of having other kids of their age who had a parent living in long-term care.
Mhm.
And so there was that part of how do I take care of myself as well as be that person, that rock, that solid foundation for my kids to help them as best as they can. So that, I mean, there was going to be emotional hits that they would be experiencing, no question. But to try to be able to provide that solid foundation and stability that I think that they really needed while I was going through my own turmoil in all of that. And also keeping the game face on at work, right?
Yeah, the compartmentalizing. Thank you,
Yes,
thank you
yes.
for sharing it, because there's so much in there, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to unpack some more. So, you also have a very unique story, and one that I followed quite closely, because you probably were one of the first people on social media to, document what you were going through while you were being an executive and all other things that were going on in your life. So tell us about your story. And
Yeah, thank you for having me join this really important conversation, Sandra. I became a caregiver at a time when I didn't even know the term caregiver existed. I honestly hadn't heard it before. It wasn't until a random post went viral on LinkedIn that I even associated the word caregiver with myself. I had just, my dad had been living with us for years as a snowbird, he would go south to Mexico for the winters. He would stay at our cottage in the summers, and on the shoulder seasons, he would live with us. And when his health deteriorated to the point that Mexico was no longer an option, and we sold the cottage and bought a home on Georgian Bay, he moved in with us full time. And he had had 5 heart attacks in the previous 20 years. He had back issues. He was pretty frail, but always feisty, and always, independent, living in his separate apartment in our house. And then during COVID, in fact, in 2021, um, he had a terrible case of ascites, or swelling of the abdomen, and I took him to the hospital close to our home. And luckily, a liver specialist was on call that day, and she diagnosed him with decompensated liver disease, most likely from the heart medication that he had been on for 30 years. And told him that day, it was in June of 2021, that he had a 50% chance of being with us by the end of that year. And so what started, sort of was a ticking clock, basically, and this finite feeling that he wouldn't be with us much longer. And as, sort of his daughter, sort of, and him living in our home, really took it upon myself to help him through that journey. So special diet, trips to the hospital every 2 weeks to have his abdomen drained, helping with the side effects of liver disease, which can be confusion and itchiness, and really helping him to build an end of life bucket list and figure out what were the things that he needed to do in the 6 months that he had remaining that would help him basically feel ready to leave at the end of the year. And so I was also in a corporate executive role at the time. I was the chief revenue officer at a Bay Area startup called Grokr, and I was doing my best to juggle all the balls of, sort of taking care of my dad, doing, sort of being there for him through this journey, taking care of our house and family. We also had my stepdaughter living with us at the time, who was struggling with mental health issues, and then taking care of my team and doing my best to drive sales for our company. And so it was a lot. It was a lot. And, sort of, we had a plan to take advantage of medical assistance in dying. That was Dad's request. He wanted to kind of go out on his terms. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know which word is the right word, when the date rolled around, he wasn't ready. And so we actually got 9 extra bonus months with him. He lived until August of 2022, and eventually succumbed actually to complications from a broken hip versus the liver disease, which we managed to get under control. So he passed in hospice, never took advantage of long-term care. He was never in assisted living. He went from our home to hospital to hospice, and that's where he eventually passed. But it was a lot. And in February of 22, I made the decision to step back from work to focus on his needs, and also give myself a little more bandwidth to take care of myself. And I ended up starting my own company, which I called Susan Van Klink Coaching and Advisory. I have since pivoted that into a new company, SVK and Associates. It was never really my intention to be self-employed or to start a company. It was always my intention to be a corporate executive. But when things changed at home, I needed to change my career and my focus and honestly my contract with work, because I couldn't sustain two very full-time jobs.
Wow. And I just want to say the three of us are sitting here right now, and there are going to be many people watching this because we know, we could probably, between the three of us, come up with, you know, tens, 10, 20, 30 people that we know. I got a call last night from a dear friend whose mother is 101 and has fallen in the last month 5 times and is going in and out of hospital, even though the doctor says she doesn't have long to live, and just navigating it. And she's an executive. But I wanted to be able to read a stat to you, and it just dovetails into the next question that I'm going to ask you, because you've talked about your impact on work, and you've both used that keeping your game face on. I like to say compartmentalize, and going in, and all's great, even though you've got this emotional wave happening on your home front. But and I'm going to specifically talk to start off with you, Sue, for a very specific reason. But according to, and there's tons of research on there, who released a report in 2023, Caregiving and Gender Inequality, which emphasizes that women account for approximately 75% of unpaid caregivers worldwide. And that goes in line with all of the stats, but it also reports that caregiving significantly impacts a women's physical, mental health, leading to higher rates of depression, anxiety, burnout compared to men. And it also underscores a huge economic toll on women, having to reduce their work hours and withdrawing from the workforce. And that's happened to the three of us. And so when I think about, think about the impact that this is having, and it's only getting worse because more and more traditionalists are at that age and stage. They're living longer, but they're not exactly living in a healthy manner. They're being cared for. And so, in your experience, what are some of the most unexpected challenges that you've seen women face, or you've faced yourselves, when balancing caregiving responsibilities and their professional, ambitions? You've talked about it a little bit here, but I'd love to talk about more about how that felt, of what you did to kind of cover up. And Sue, when we first talked about doing this podcast, you were shocked that it was mainly women who were the caregivers, because you thought it might be equal. I sent you then the research, and you were,
Yeah.
oh my gosh. So tell me your thoughts. I know that's a lot, but I just basically, what are the unexpected challenges that you've seen women and yourself you faced?
Well, it makes sense that women take the lion's share. It really does. And going, sort of, I would have wholeheartedly agreed with the stats if not for my experience and having so many men reach out to share their challenges with caregiving for a parent, for a spouse, for a child with illness or special needs. And so I don't doubt your stats, and I believe your stats. I just really want to speak up for the men out there, that there is a burden to caregiving that hits both genders. But I accept that it hits women disproportionately, and I think there are a few reasons for that. One is, I think we are still living in a world that raises women to be caregivers and expects women to be caregivers. And I think we define ourselves that way in some ways. For me personally, there was never any contest between taking care of my dad and doing my job. My taking care of my dad became the most important job that I had. And as much as I loved my work and I loved my team and I loved the company that I was working for, you know, taking care of my dad was a really sacred responsibility for me. And I think,
I
I
just
think,
I just want to jump in there because and that is amazing. But not everybody has a luxury financially of being able
yeah,
to do that. And I just probably 90% of the people don't have the luxury of being able to, to step away. So I just, for the
and
sake
I
of
heard
everybody
from them.
listening,
I heard from
yeah,
them when, sort of through my posts, because the reaction to my first post was so strong that it became clear to me that there were a lot of silent sufferers out there. There were a lot of people that were hiding their caregiving from their work. There was a lot of fear that if people found out that they were a caregiver, that their work would be terminated. And in fact, many people told me their story that that is exactly what happened. So people
yeah,
live in fear, they live in silence. It's the hardest job you'll ever do. And I was extremely fortunate that I could say, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to focus primarily on my dad, although I needed to work, I needed to pay the bills, but I could step back and I could cut back. And I had flexibility in how I worked. I just wrote a post about why are companies forcing return to office.
I
We know
loved that
the
post, by the
impact.
way.
Yeah, the impact on caregivers is huge. Caregivers can only caregive if there's flexible work arrangements and the ability for, sort of them to work on their terms as long as the work is getting done. And I think companies are a bit tone deaf right now. And honestly, economically, we need people to take the caregiving burden on because our systems, all systems in almost every country in the world, would collapse if caregivers did not give of themselves as freely as they do. But there's no doubt, I think, that if for the people that can, so here's three buckets for the people that continue to work. I just recently spoke to someone who said, I maintained my full time job and I wish I hadn't. That I look back 10 years now and say, why didn't I take the time to be with my mom when she was dying? So there's the regret of people who weren't able to cut back or chose not to cut back and feeling like they really missed out or lost time with a loved one in the time that they had left. There's a second bucket who managed to do it all, who managed to be full time caregivers and full time executives or workers, and their own personal health and mental health takes an incredible toll. And then there's the third kind of person that are like me, that they take the hit financially, and they take the hit from a career perspective, and they take a step back and they figure out how to make it work at personal cost to themselves. I haven't heard of a fourth bucket. If you know of a fourth bucket, I'd love to hear of that fourth bucket, but that's been my experience.
Deborah, what are your thoughts?
Well, because I live in the world of seniors care, uh, you know, I don't know, maybe that's the fourth bucket. I think because I was aware of the resources that were there, although I never imagined that I'd be moving my husband into long-term care. From a caregiving perspective, it's a huge transition. As you know, we think about the physical, emotional lift that's involved with providing care, whether it be adult children or spouses. There is a lot of that hands-on. I call it like I was the care boss. I managed all the 27 different specialists and the hundreds, if not thousands, of appointments and tests that we were going through just to get a diagnosis for Ty. And, I am a bit of a control freak, as I think caregivers, people who really step into it, and they're having to learn new language and new processes and procedures and all of those things. And so having the opportunity to, whether it be assisted living, retirement, or long-term care, the thing with long-term care is that this is a government funded support that for people who don't have the income to be able to support paying monthly for private care, that there's that element there. And it's also a learning curve in how do you then become, take off the care boss name tag and become a partner in care. And I think that emotional journey for families, there's guilt around feeling like they're stepping away, they're letting go, they're trying to find a way to have trust and connection with these strangers that they've never met before, that are going to be spending likely more time with their loved one than they're able to, particularly if, like in my situation, working full time, commuting an hour each way, and having two kids at home that I needed to be there for. And so it's like, I think sometimes in a caregiving, we need to look at it from a strategic approach, accepting that the solution may be suboptimal. I think of somebody moving into care as suboptimal because 97% of Canadians want to age in place at home. I'm not sure what the other 3% are thinking, but all of us want to stay healthy, stay vibrant, and live in our home and not live in a community setting for as long as possible. And yet, when we are dealing with health issues and ailments, we need to be able to look at it objectively to say, okay, what is the best approach that we can take here? What are the resources that can support us? And unfortunately, the healthcare system does not make it easy to navigate. And that's why you're seeing people that are now healthcare navigators, people that you can tap into to know how the system works. And I think the biggest message for me with caregivers is to really be able to look at what is within scope, what's within your capacity, whether it be financially, emotionally, physically. Because I am convinced that my mom had a stroke in her 70s because of the emotional and physical heavy lifting she had to do physically and metaphorically with my dad, who had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia, and made her promise to never put him in an old folks home.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And yeah, that's guilt, right? And you
Yeah.
hear that all the time.
Well,
So,
and if you think of Gabor Mate's book, When the Body Says No, there really is a physical toll that's taken when people have to undertake things that, sort of that become too much for them and they feel like they can't put it down. I was very fortunate. I did what I did willingly and knowingly and not out of guilt. People people used to reach out to me on LinkedIn and say, "Your dad, he must have been such a great dad. You must have loved him so much." And my response was, "Yes, I love my dad. He was not a great dad. He was a very absent, work 20 hours a day and play 20 hours a day kind of dad. I very rarely saw him growing up. He left my mom when I was 15 and left us, fairly destitute. So there's lots of reasons I could have said, no, I don't want to take care of this man. But in the end, I loved him. He transformed through the journey, and we had we had magical moments, through his final uh, 15 years of life. That doesn't happen for everyone. And Sandra, we talked about this before. Lots of people have very difficult relationships with their parents that don't allow for them to be the primary caregiver. Also, had my dad not been living with us when he got sick, he would probably have gone from his independent living situation into assisted living. I have no doubt that he would not have chosen to come and live in our home through his illness. It just happened that that's where he was, and moving him out wasn't an option for us. But there's so many different scenarios and variations and
oh, yes,
layers
and
of
how we
emotion.
get through it.
And yeah, it's just like it's like I said, every caregiver journey is a snowflake. There is no one experience. And yes, you can say there's the assisted living caregiver experience and there's the dying and home caregiving experience. There are some similarities there, but even that's different. But Deborah, you talked about anticipated grief, and I lived with that a lot in those 15 months. And Sandra, you talk about compartmentalizing. I was going back through some of my posts through that 15-month time frame. And I wrote in one of them, I had tears on my face an hour ago, and now I'm showing up to a team call, sort of with a smile on my face, sort of talking
Yes.
about sales opportunities. There really is this need um, to put on a face and go back to work. And sometimes that's helpful, and sometimes that's really harmful. But it is one of the things that women and caregivers experience, is this need to bifurcate themselves in
Yes.
order to make the different parts of their life work.
So that brings me the next question, Deborah. If you can talk about the strategies and support systems you found most helpful in your journey in managing your emotional and practical aspects of caregiving and maintaining your career at the very same time.
Yeah. So, I'm a socially selective introvert. So I don't have this huge network of people and going online and going out to community, caregiver support groups. But I had friends, and you're one of them, Sandra, that would be that regular touch point to be checking in on how I was doing, not as much about how's Ty doing and what's going on. And because the
Yes.
exhaustion of having to give people updates, it was almost 2 years, year and a half, 2 years of trying to pursue a diagnosis. That was drama filled and people always looking for updates. So I very quickly, I mean, this is way back in it was a blog, I think, that I started. I don't even know what platform it was on, so that I could provide updates so that I wasn't inundated with that call at the end of the day. So how did the appointment go? Because that started to build resentment, even though I know people were trying to support. I also engaged with a therapist, and it was one of the best decisions that I made. And she was very pragmatic. I think, she probably could track me that I'm a pragmatic, logical, but she would still make me go to the place of how are you feeling and expressing emotions. And that was just really annoying, but necessary. And she also, I think, because this was a marathon, not a sprint, Ty had a very rare, degenerative, fatal disease that only 400 people in the world had at that time. There was a lot of unknowns. And so she helped me to stay in focus with the kind of pace, because I'm an overachiever and wanting to be able to keep all of the balls in the air and all the plates spinning. And also, initially, when I went to see her, I was looking for grief support for my kids. And she said, before I meet your kids, I want to meet you. And then that became probably a few months of those conversations because she needed to make sure that my bucket was as full as possible. And with work, again, I'm very privileged that I worked in seniors care, and my boss, the president, Paul, at the time, when I said to him, I don't think I can keep doing this and I don't want to let you and the organization down, he gave me a really powerful reframe. And he said, Deb, I want you to think of your work right now, in whatever short time frame we're talking, whether it's weeks or months or however long. I want you to think of your work as a job, not as your career.
Wow.
And I mean, first of all, coming from the president, and he was able to see around the corner, knowing that if I were to make that mindset shift, don't think of it as a career right now, just keep your head down, stay in your lane, do the work you need to do, was so empowering for me. And I don't think that it affected my output and quality of my work, but I stopped beating myself up. Because when we look at things as a career, it was a huge mindset shift for me. So being able to be, not everybody in work knew that my husband was ill, and most of them didn't even know when he moved into long-term care, because I didn't openly talk about it, not because I didn't think it was appropriate. I just am a pretty private person. And I also didn't want to burden other people with that poor woman whose husband's now living in a nursing home. that I didn't want to have that persona about me. So I kept my circle pretty small, and that supported me. But I think you need to have that resource, those people that you can trust, and have those sacred connections where you can just let it all out and decompartmentalize yourself, as well as being open to looking for what are the things that are within my control that I can do to manage this for me right now, because letting go is not an option.
And Deborah, I just want to say you also have a wicked sense of humor and a dark sense of humor, which during that time, and full disclosure, Deb and I have been friends for decades. And the one thing that you were always able to bring that to the table, even at, in those, sorry.
Yeah.
The
Yeah, yeah.
host is not supposed to cry, but I just remember, like, I knew Ty, and, I knew your parents, and I knew what you went through, and you also knew you were there for what I went through. And for some people, it's different. For me, I went through everything, and then I broke down. Both my parents were sick pretty much at the same time. And it was managing, they were living in our home for a while because we thought we could do it and have full time careers, my husband and I. And then when we finally, the doctor said, this isn't safe for you and it's not safe for them, and we put them in a home. But it was a constant thing. I went through with a smile on my face, compartmentalized in work, pretending it wasn't happening, didn't let anybody know. And then I had a breakdown after it was all over and both my parents had died. So I kind of waited and then, got sick, got burnt out and all that. But so Sue, tell us about you. What kept you going every day?
So there's two aspects to this. One is I do think being a caregiver can be one of the most isolating things you can do. There's almost like a closure of the mechanism that happens, and you end up being focused on what needs to be done for the person you're taking care of. I had a handful of good friends who really knew how to step in and support me, which I greatly appreciated. A wonderful husband who was always willing to help. Our biggest challenge was my dad loved Dave. He was a big fan of my husband, um, but he only wanted me. I can still
Mm.
remember the calls up from the basement, Susan, and then Dave would call back because he would know I was busy. Like, what do you want, Jer? What can I do? And he'd be like, where's Sue? And Dave would say, she's busy, Jer. And he'd say, oh, never mind, it can wait. Right. And so, as willing as Dave was to step in and help and be part of the journey, he, my dad really preferred me. And even when I tried to get outside help to come in and help with the showers and some of the physical care that was needed more towards the end, that was a struggle. And it was really, my dad's comfort level was with me. And so I walked that line all the time of how much do I sacrifice of myself to give dad what he wanted and needed, and how much do I push back and say no, this is my limit, this is my line. I used emotional freedom technique and a tapping therapist to really help process a lot of what I was feeling. I'm a huge believer in it, of tapping through the grief, the guilt, the overwhelm, all of those things. But it's a lonely journey for a lot of people. And one of the things at LinkedIn was my outlet. It didn't start out to be. The post that I posted was such a spur of the moment. It had been one of those mornings, and I posted about it while I was sitting hospital bed, beside my dad's hospital bed during one of his procedures. And the outpouring of like me too was so strong. And what I realized is there are a lot of people that had no voice and had no connection and were suffering in silence and caregiving alone. And so I just kept posting, sort of when the spirit hit, because I felt like there were people who needed to hear what I had to say and what my experiences were, because they weren't able to do that themselves. And I did a lot of like when people would respond to my messages, I would invite them to put time on my calendar and have a conversation with them, because it is lonely and isolating and difficult. And so those are some of the things that I did to get through it. And as I said, finding ways to take time away. It was the hardest thing to do as a caregiver, was to find support to come in and uh, take over with your loved one. But every time I did, it was like a breath of fresh air. It was so healthy and so good for my soul that I just, as much work as it was to organize and as hard as it was to find people who could help and were willing to help, every time I did, it bought me another 2, 3, 4 months of energy and oxygen. So those are some of the things that I did. And um, in the end, we got through it. None of it was easy. And, sort of, um, and I think we've talked about it, Sandra, that I look at every caregiving situation as part blessing and part burden. And,
Yes.
My dad's caregiving situation was, probably 50 to 60% burden and 40 to 50% blessing. I was lucky. For some people, it's much more burden than blessing. Um, we've talked about the fact that at not long after my dad passed, we had a situation arise in our family where a newborn baby, my great nephew, needed a home, and my husband Dave and I took him in at 3 weeks of age. I would say that caregiving journey has been 90% blessing, and 10% burden. And so there's really, in my head anyway, there's recognition that it's not all sunshine and light and angels on high, but it's not all doom and gloom and obligation and sacrifice. There really is a balance of both things in the caregiver journey, at least in my experience.
I just want to say your posts were incredible, and I think so many people responded to them, and I was following you through the process. These posts are actually on LinkedIn, and I will have Spencer also put your LinkedIn in there so that they can go back and read some of those posts and the comments. So it was therapy for you, but it was also for so many people that were able to almost say yes, that like you said, me too, this is happening to me. And what I liked about is, it's easy to put these things on Facebook or Instagram, but LinkedIn is very much, everybody's got their business game face on. And I thought that was sort of a crack in that shell that, hey, not only are we professionals, but we are dealing with this on a very we're dealing with very personal matters. And some of us, you're just coming out of COVID and all the other things. And some of us are struggling every single day. But my next question comes into, and it's really a good segue. It's about, I want to ask each of you, what can the workplace, specifically leaders, do to better support employees that are going through this? And I didn't declare, but I also felt like it would be a black mark against me at that time if I did declare. So, Deborah, you're in this business. You hear these stories from people and what they're going through, or what they see what your clients see people go through. And there's also when you are a corporate person or you are working, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You can be the receptionist or you can be the CEO. You go into the homes and sometimes you feel like you're being judged by the people that can, like, I can't make it for that meeting, or can we do this meeting at another time? So what is it that you think that organizations and leaders specifically can do to support people?
Well, I think to start with the leader, whoever that person is reporting to, you need to have a relationship based on that trust and mutual respect to understand what that staff member is experiencing. What does their current reality look like? as it relates to the care role that they have, and what's working and what are they struggling with. And of course, coming from corporate, I know that we have to walk this fine line, that it isn't just a free for all, and don't worry, just take care of things and come check in when you can. I think it's more about, all right, let's look at this. And I just go back to that practicality and having a strategic approach to it. What are the supports that you need? How can we, if we can, support you with that? And are there opportunities to make temporary modifications to your job? I mean, for me, this was pre-COVID, so working from home was still very much a luxury. Um, and how do we then make sure that we have check-ins that you are able to do the work that you've been hired to do, and the supports that you require? But also, I think it's having an agreement as to what both parties are going to be accountable for in this period of time where things are going to look different than if there was no caregiving aspect that was happening. I think the other thing is having the awareness that if you're providing care to somebody, and I'm going to say in the world of an aging parent or a spouse that's ill, that things will change. This is not static. And so how can we be prepared for if you know what the diagnosis is? So for me, we didn't know that Ty would live for 4 years in long-term care. They actually thought it would be a lot shorter. But knowing that there was going to come a point in time when things would get more intense, to be able to know that you've got permission to be able to go to your boss at that point in time and say, things have changed. We need to just relook at these things. And that there needs to be a level of accountability with the employee that, again, I'll speak from the corporate perspective, is that they're not taking advantage. And I know that sounds harsh. I don't mean it to sound that way. But you need to have a grown-up conversation about it. And then also to look at, I'm not up to speed on the government programs, but when it comes to needing to take time off when you're a primary caregiver and those types of things, I think it's really important to be able to look at the full spectrum, to say what would be the minimal we could do, and what would be some of the maximum interventions. Like, I need to take a 6-month leave of absence, to maybe I can make these smaller adjustments, and understanding what that cadence of care looks like for that person.
I love that, because I think having those grown-up conversations, and now that we're on the other side of this new world of work that we're working in, and Sue, you're probably going to address flexibility, which I think is really important. I just want to say one thing. I think there's also this mindset. We've got to the place in the workplace where we accept that when people have children and the school calls, that you can say, oh, the school's on the line, and everybody knows that person can leave and it's okay. My kid's sick. But now, because when that home called about my parents, that call was as important to me as when my children were young and the school called. And so if we could just get into that mindset that caregiving falls under that same umbrella, whether it's your parent, your aging parent, or it's your child or your sick child. If we could open ourselves up to that, we would be living in a better workplace. And Sue, I want you to address it as well, because I think you put that blog post up yesterday. I think it's a very important blog post around flexibility. I certainly agree with you, but maybe you can talk about how leadership, and you've been a leader as well, how you can support employees.
Well, I want to echo a lot of what Deborah said. I think it's such a complicated equation. Caregiving, requires mental and physical bandwidth for months or years. It's usually not, like even my dad is a great example. He was given, a 6-month diagnosis. He lived 15. He could have lived much longer if he didn't break his hip. So there's no known end date to the caregiving situation, and it is a little bit like the frog in the pot syndrome, where the water just keeps getting hotter and hotter, and you're not necessarily always aware of it. So it's hard to take time and stop and say, what do I need to make all of this work? I was very fortunate that I was able to have those conversations with my boss, my CEO. In full transparency, I think my company at the time did a fabulous job of supporting me through the first part of the journey. But when there was a realization that there was no known end in sight, things shifted and changed. So I also want to, sort of just share that and I understood why, right? There was a part of me that said, they are small, scrappy startup trying to make ends meet, sort of they needed revenue to survive. They needed somebody who could be all in driving that revenue. I was not that person. We had a mutual parting of the ways. It was very collaborative and professional. But there was also I'm not about to tell every caregiver out there that your employer will support you 100% because I can't make that claim. I think giving employees flexibility, as much flexibility as you can, making expectations clear, and negotiating if that's possible, providing some um, accommodation and support is really important. Uh, but yeah, Sandra, I've been hearing a lot, I've been seeing a lot of posts about return to office and these 5 day a week return to office mandates, and it boggles my mind because all the data says that it's not in the best interest of the employee. It's not even in the best interest of the company, that 5 days a week in office cultures tend to be more negative, less productive cultures. And yet there's still this force that's being applied to take us back there. And it's old school thinking. And unfortunately, I think it's a lot of out of touch leaders who they want to see minions in the office working hard, because in that in their definition is what productivity looks like. And the three of us would tell you that's not what productivity looks like. Productivity is me on the couch at 9 o'clock at night with my laptop on my lap and a dog on either side, right? Productivity is me working until 4, taking Callum to gymnastics for an hour, and then coming back and picking up and sort of getting work done when I get back. Productivity is flexibility. Caregivers need flexibility. That's the number one thing that companies can give them. And because you don't know who's a caregiver in your organization, the best thing you can do is give your company flexibility. And then measure and expect results. And that's where culture comes from, is having good leadership and clear expectations. But a lot of companies don't have that. And so, they want to see the whites of your eyes. And that, I think, will
as opposed
hurt
to your
them in the long run.
performance.
Yeah,
Measuring
exactly.
what the output is. So one last question for you both, and as you know, this is a podcast that is about bridging the 124-year gap to equality, and that number goes up and down. The economy, it can actually, that number may go up because women become more marginalized. So what I'd like to do is ask you, what is it that you're doing in your life to bridge that gap between men and women?
I can start if you want, Sandra. So for me, I have an executive coaching practice. In addition to being the CEO of SVK and Associates, which is really more focused on driving revenue and growth for startups. And the majority of my executive coaching practice is women. It's not 100%. I'm an equal opportunity coach, but I really believe in mentoring and coaching and helping women to um, show up in a way that allows them to be in consideration for the big jobs. And people don't just get there on their own. It does take mentorship, it takes coaching, it takes development, it takes sponsorship. And so those are things I use my network to help people find better opportunities for themselves. And I try to speak loudly about the need for equity, the need for equality, and really shine lights in places that I think need a light to be shone. So it doesn't feel like enough, to be totally honest with you. I've been the chief diversity officer in my past, and I think it's a critical role. I hate to see that companies are stepping back from it because I
Yes.
do think it's incredibly needed. But it feels like there's a pendulum, and the pendulum always swings, and it's I'm looking forward to when it starts to swing back towards flexibility, equity, equality, and I hope that that happens soon.
And it doesn't always have to be grand gestures, it can be just supporting other women as well. I always like to say it's one woman at a time, supporting, one woman at a time. Deborah, your thoughts?
So, in the work that I do in healthcare is a lot of women. So certainly in seniors care, the majority of the team members are women, and then I also support family members, and the majority of them are women. It's always great when we've got a gentleman on the call that's a family member because we get to see how the women want to support the men who are having difficulty in expressing their emotions and their grief. And so, when I think about the framework that I work with, that I talk about, that I'm obsessed with every day, the relational approach, and really helping both the team members and the families to be less transactional, more relational. That really is about how we're showing up with our relational presence, the type of relational environment, and the relational leadership, which in my mind all boils down to how do we build trust and respect and build relational confidence in how we are relating to, interacting, and treating each other. So I don't think that I'm consciously thinking about it as a way to bridge that gap between genders. I think of it as if we can be more intentional with how we show up and interact with each other, with the intention of how do I build trust? How do I make deposits into this relational bank account? How do I actually show up like we want to care for and support each other, and have it be more of that, as Sue talks about, the blessing versus the burden, even in the relationship and how we are coming together as partners in care. I think that my audience being primarily women is also a way to help equip and empower them to step into what I like to say is there's power in your presence, so make your presence matter. Step into your presence with intention, by design, with this relational approach.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for sharing your stories. And I know that you have spent time with us today and probably are about to inspire many, many women and men as well to look at this journey. And hopefully, leaders will look at this journey of caregiving and start, as Deborah, reframing it. Something that you always talked about in leadership is just reframing how we think. And I think I do believe that we are in a world right now where we have to think differently about caregiving, especially for employees, and flexibility is key. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
We are at a crucial juncture in history, and our equality is not a nice to have. It is now beyond negotiation. This is our future, our fight.
This episode of Women on Wisdom is sponsored by TalentWise Collective, a global talent development company that curates solutions for your organization's needs and culture. Please note that the opinions and comments of the guests or hosts may not align with TalentWise Collective. If you are interested in having Sandra speak at an event, or wish to reach out for any other inquiries, you can connect through our email at connecttwc@talentwisecollective.com. That is, connecttwc@talentwisecollective.com. Thank you.